Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Alan Alexander, General Secretary of the Royal Society of Edinburgh, and it's my great pleasure to welcome you to this discussion forum, presented jointly with the British Academy on the draft legislation proposed by the UK Government to implement the recommendations of the Smith Commission. Between 2012 and 2014, the RSE and the British Academy jointly promoted a series of events aimed, as the title of the series indicated, at enlightening the constitutional debate. All the events that were open to the public were very well attended. Most were oversubscribed. An account of each event was published on the websites of the two academies, and at the end of the series we published a book, free on demand, that had to be reprinted within a couple of weeks. It was also published as an e-book, and there were many thousands of downloads from Scotland, the rest of the UK, and around the world. I mention this because the response to the series demonstrated that there is a clear demand for dispassionate, expert, and non-partisan information about constitutional change. That demand continues, and this evening's forum is the first event in a post-referendum occasional series of events that the two academies will promote. The feedback from the pre-referendum series was overwhelmingly positive, and we intend to continue to provide a platform for expert analysis of the continuing process by which devolution will develop. Let me now hand over to our chair for tonight, my distinguished colleague, Professor Gavin McCrone, former Chief Economic Advisor to the Scottish Office and the author of an excellent analysis of the economic implications of independence, already in a second edition. Perhaps, Gavin, there may even be a need for a third. Gavin, thank you.
Thank you very much, Alan, and welcome to everybody, and a rather less warm welcome for anyone who's forgotten to turn off their mobile phone. My job is to introduce the speakers. And first of all, we have Joe Armstrong, who is Executive Director of Fiscal Affairs Scotland, a new body which provides regular analysis of Scotland's public finances. She's also an honorary professor at the Business School in Glasgow University and has a long experience, 25 years, of dealing with the kind of issues she's going to be talking about tonight. She was Budget Advisor to the Scottish Parliament's Economy, Energy and Tourism Committee, as well as its local government committee, and gave evidence to Parliament's select committees. Her professional career spans oil and gas and financial services. She worked for a while with the Royal Bank, and she was a senior civil servant in the Scottish Government. She's currently chair of Enable Scotland and a trustee of Social Investment Scotland. She will go first. We then have Professor John Kay, who is no stranger here. He's spoken, I think, at this society several times before, and certainly at the David Hume Institute on several occasions, and so many of you will know him quite well. He's a Scot. He was educated at Edinburgh University. He then moved to Oxford, and he was a fellow of St John's College in 1970, just as I left, and is still a fellow of St John's College. He was one of the people that helped to found the Institute of Fiscal Studies. And he chaired the review of UK equity markets and long-term decision-making, which reported to the Secretary of State for Business, Innovation and Skills in July 2012. He's visiting professor at the London School of Economics, and he is a fellow of the British Academy as well as the Royal Society of Edinburgh. He is a regular weekly contributor to the Financial Times. Many of you will probably have read his column. He takes a special interest in making economics comprehensible to the intelligent layperson. He's the author of several books, The Truth About Markets, The Long and the Short of It, and most recently, Obliquity, which I find difficult to pronounce. He has a forthcoming book coming out shortly called Other People's Money. And if that also is intended for intelligent lay people, I'm sure it will have a big sale. So that's John, and he will go second. And thirdly, we have Professor Nicola McEwen, who is Professor of Politics at Edinburgh University and Associate Director of the ESRC Centre on Constitutional Change. under the Future of the UK and Scotland programme. She's also Associate Director of Research for the School of Social and Political Science, with a leading role in promoting knowledge exchange and research impact. She's not only studied Scotland, but also Quebec and various other places, and has established herself as one of the leading commentators on the situation in Scotland. So those are your three speakers. Please welcome them, and then I will call on Joe Armstrong.
Thank you, Gavin. The last time I was here, about 8 months ago, it was about 8 months before the referendum, and I remember talking about the uncertainty that we were facing and dealing with the issues of finance and taxes, principally around the Scotland Act 2012 powers, and principally around the yes, what might be possible under a yes vote. And I'm pretty sure at that point in time we all thought, well, post the referendum things will be a lot clearer, will be a lot less uncertain, and life will be a much easier world to navigate through. I think probably what I'm going to say tonight, and I've no doubt John and Nicola are going to say that, well, actually the referendum and probably the post-referendum negotiations have actually thrown up, I suspect, more uncertainty rather than less, and more challenges than perhaps we might have thought possible if we'd had a yes vote, a no vote 8 months ago. I've been asked to talk about the specific tax powers in relation to the Smith Commission. But I think it's worthwhile probably starting off with reminding ourselves about the Scotland 2012 powers again, not least because we haven't yet seen them in action, and some of the issues that are around them have serious implications for what and how we might implement the Smith Commission powers. So we start off with the land and building transactions tax, which replaces the stamp duty or the slab tax that was levied on property, both commercial and residential. The new tax had been implemented in April of this year, and I know Revenue Scotland is all desperately ready to start take responsibility for managing that tax. But actually, before we've even seen it implemented, we've already seen a change to the Scottish Government's requirement or expectations of that tax and how it's going to apply it. So I suspect that's the start of an experience that we're going to face as Scotland takes control of taxes that are also taxes being applied down south, is we've actually now got tax competition. And we're seeing governments reacting as a consequence of one government doing something slightly differently. So that tax is expected to raise about 440 to 460 million in a full year. And the and the landfill tax, which also kicks in April of this year, is about to raise about £100 million. So together they raise over £550 million in a full year. But that's based on the evidence that we have from the Government's Economic and Revenue Statement, or the GERS document, and the most recent data we have takes us only up to 2012-13, although next week we've got an update to that. So we'll have information on what those two taxes are projected to raise based on the 2013-14 financial year. That's an important issue and one I'll come back to. And the last tax that we are going to be seeing applying as a consequence of the Scotland 2012 Act is the Scottish rate of income tax. And that doesn't kick in this April, but kicks in next April. And that is the Scottish Government, the UK Treasury, will cut the income tax rate that you and I will be paying, assuming we're all Scottish taxpayers, will cut it by 10 percentage points, but basically half it. And in doing so, they will also reduce the Barnett Block grant the Scottish Government gets by an equivalent amount of money, forcing the Scottish Government to actually levy a Scottish rate of income tax. If you remember, we currently have under the powers a Scottish tax varying power. It's never been used in the whole time since devolution. This measure forces the Scottish Government to levy a rate of income tax on Scottish taxpayers. And that is by far the largest tax raising power that we're going to have. And it raises, or it did raise in 2012-13, around £11 billion. So we have 3 taxes being implemented this year and next. We don't know how they're going to work. We haven't yet actually seen them in action. And we're now going to apply, we're already looking to adapt them and add to them through the Smith Commission. So I think it's important to have an understanding that's currently underway, and the issues that I'm going to talk about relate as much to them as they do to the Smith Commission new powers. And those are extending the Scottish rate of income tax. So the tax that's coming in next April is being extended. So it's not just halving the base rate, it's actually allowing the Scottish Government power over the rate and thresholds at which the tax is applied. It doesn't cover savings, it doesn't cover dividend income, it applies only to earned income. And it can't vary who's in the tax base, but it gives significantly more powers than the Scotland Act powers do. The second change is that we're now going to receive a share of what's levied at the UK on VAT. So the VAT amount, the revenue raised in VAT, half of that will be given to the Scottish Parliament. And again, as a consequence of that, the Barnett Block grant will be adjusted accordingly. That's a large amount of money, and that's roughly about £5 billion, £4.5 to £5 billion in a full year. Air passenger duties, that's the rate, that's the levy that we charge each of us for leaving a Scottish airport, and that can be varied. Now, there's been a lot of discussion, certainly in the last year, 18 months, about the possibility of actually abolishing air passenger duties to help support the regional airports in the UK, and notably here clearly for Scottish airports. Abolishing it would mean having to find around £230 million a year, because that's roughly what's raised in revenues from that tax. And the final new tax that's been indicated through the Smith Commission is the aggregates levy, which is a tax on commercial exploitation of aggregates in Scotland. Can be varied, it can be replaced. It is not large in the grand scheme of things. It's about £50 million in a full year. So if you add together the taxes I've just discussed, along with non-domestic rates income, which raises around about £3 billion, certainly £2.5 billion a year, and council tax, which is around about just under £2 billion a year, that means the Scottish Parliament will have control of about 40% of its revenues, clearly excluding North Sea taxes. Now, there's been many debates since the Smith Commission published as to whether that's sufficiently large control, sufficiently sophisticated control, because clearly some of it, the assignation of the value-added tax, actually giving people the value-added tax, isn't changing the rates, isn't changing the people or the products it's levied on, it's simply just getting a lump of money. But so not having those sorts of controls, there's an argument saying that the Smith Commission's actually underselling Scotland and we're not getting enough powers. But nonetheless, it's a significant change from what we currently have. The other argument would be is why don't we have North Sea taxes in our mix? Some argue that's a massive omission, and no doubt that's something that we probably want to raise at the Q&A session. But in giving us those additional revenues and powers, it does raise, I think, quite a number of challenges for the Scottish Parliament. It has not had many levers to date, non-domestic rates and council tax being the most obvious levers it's had. It then begs the question, have we the right institutional arrangements in place to make sure that we can actually manage our own affairs as a consequence of taking on these powers? In my précis of what I was going to talk about tonight, I raised about a number of issues that I want to cover off briefly to help, again, the debate later on. First of all, what is it we're actually agreeing is what's raised in Scotland? I talked about the fact that some of the information we have goes back to 2013-14, in fact 2012-13. We do not know exactly how much each of those taxes is actually raised in Scotland. But we know that the Barnett Block grant that currently operates is going to be adjusted to reflect what it is we think we're going to raise from those taxes. The Office of Budget Responsibility currently projects what they think is the likely tax raised from those taxes for the current expected Scottish rate of income tax, the land and buildings transactions tax, and the landfill tax. I think it would be extraordinary if, certainly in the next year to 18 months, if we didn't see their remit being extended to cover these new taxes, but that still has to be agreed. But the issue is, if we don't currently know exactly how much is raised in those taxes, and we're relying on a third party to tell us what's raised to then adjust the Barnett formula accordingly, do we think the OBR is sufficiently neutral to prevent debate, discussion, negotiation, falling out as a consequence? Critical point if we are going to be effectively receiving less in the Barnett Block grant. We need to believe that the people who are projecting the taxes that are being applied to the Barnett Block grant adjustment mechanism, that they are neutral. There's an issue in my head at the moment, given all that goes on in Scotland, as to whether a body based in London will ever be deemed to be truly neutral if it produces a set of results that Scotland doesn't like. The second issue that I think is clearly important that needs to be addressed, and it applies, as I say, to the Scotland Act powers as much as it does to the new powers, is how on earth is the Barnett Block grant going to be adjusted? The Smith Commission, in its brevity, identified the phrase "no betterment, no detriment" principle, that the adjustment would be based on, if we levy a tax in Scotland, the Barnett Block grant would reflect the fact that that revenue is no longer available in Whitehall. So we've got to make sure that that adjustment doesn't produce an improvement for the UK or an improvement for Scotland. There needs to be fairness in the system of adjustments. That sounds simple, that sounds eminently sensible and fair. The application of that is going to be extraordinarily difficult. And I have no doubt John is going to pick up some of that in a bit more detail. But if you think about, if you adjust a tax or you adjust a spending arrangement in Scotland, there are implications in England and vice versa. And the Barnett Block grant is meant to reflect those, to be able to monitor where the money goes and make sure there's no detriment or betterment as a consequence of those actions. It's not just at day one, it's on an ongoing basis. So I'd like to think there'd be an army of economists involved in that exercise, and I'd like to put my hand up and be involved in it. The third issue that's just as important, I think, that needs to be discussed is how does this feed through to budget uncertainties and how those are going to be managed. If we don't know what money we're going to get for next year's spending, how do we set next year's expenditure programme? The Scotland Act 2012 identified the application of a kind of a reserve fund, about £500 million of short-term borrowing arrangement that the Scottish Government could draw on if its revenues were short in any 1 year as a consequence of either economic downturn or a misunderstanding of some of the drivers of that tax revenue. We haven't yet used it. We haven't yet applied it to the Scotland Act. It probably needs to be larger than 500 million given the additional taxes. And we don't have a body of people who've actually got tried and tested experience of applying it within Scotland. But it's absolutely fundamental to being able to ensure that we know that all our public services are fully covered, because we do know what our public services are costing and are likely to cost. So we have an issue about how do we manage the uncertainty around the public finances as a consequence of taking on tax-raising powers, tax opportunities that we don't yet understand the quantum of. And the fourth issue that I think is really important that we understand is how does all of this affect Scotland's borrowing capacity? In the Scotland Act 2012, Scotland's been given additional borrowing capacity of about £2.2 billion for long-term infrastructure investment opportunities. The Smith Commission agreed, and there's currently debate around what this might look like, that instead of having a fixed cap amount of money, could we apply the mechanism that's currently being used to allow local authorities to raise borrowing, what's called the Prudential Code? Could we try and use that in Scotland so that we've got a more dynamic mechanism for assessing how much debt or borrowings the Scottish Government could raise. But clearly, to be able to work out what borrowing you're going to raise in that way, you've then got to work out, well, what tax revenues you're going to generate to be able to support that borrowing. And as I've clearly just said, that tax raising amount is unclear, unknown. So whilst we want to see whether the Prudential Borrowing Code might work, it does beg the question, what's the basis of assessment in identifying what that borrowing capacity might look like? A fixed cap might actually look quite attractive once we've gone through these machinations. I think none of these issues are insurmountable by any stretch of the imagination. No doubt we'll have some sort of negotiated settlement. I think it's interesting, I'd quite to read out to you from a letter from the First Minister to Kenny Gibson, who's chair of the Scottish Parliament's Finance Committee, when answering questions around the level of taxes to be raised from stamp duty land tax. He said, given that my forecasts are endorsed by the Scottish Fiscal Commission, so the Scottish Government's using an independent body called the Scottish Fiscal Commission to derive its own set of estimates or projections for the Scottish land and building transactions tax. Given my forecasts are endorsed by the Scottish Fiscal Commission and the UK governments are endorsed by the OBR, we agreed that we would use an average of these forecasts, which resulted in a value of 494 million being assessed. So we are going to end up with negotiated settlements. We're going to end up with OBR on the one side and the Fiscal Commission on the other side. We're going to end up with debate, dialogue, falling out. It isn't insurmountable, but it's definitely not going to be simple and straightforward. I think the new tax powers beyond the referendum were probably relatively easily secured. There's a debate about whether we've got enough, but I actually hope and believe that the implementation of these new powers need to be undertaken under a much more detailed evaluation of the implications of that implementation to make sure we get the right mechanisms in place before we launch forth and take them all. So the notion that we might, for example, introduce the enhanced Scottish rate of income tax next April seems to me fraught with difficulties. Whilst it might sound attractive, I think it's a dangerous one to perhaps go down. So I'm happy to take questions on any of that, but I thought it'd be useful just to give you the backcloth against which we are working, which is Scotland Act 2012, a number of the key implementation issues that are not insurmountable, but are simply not simple and not easy to see a pathway through as we speak tonight. Thank you.
The phrase Barnett consequential doesn't trip off the tongue any more easily than the word obliquity does. But I think over the next few months and years, we're going to have to learn to repeat that particular phrase quite a lot. I thought tonight, rather than get in a detailed discussion of Barnett consequential issues, and we may wish to look at some of these in the course of the discussion we're going to have later, I thought I might focus on the issue that certainly ought to concern everyone in your room. What is it going to mean for me as a result of the changes which are being proposed and implemented in the Commission? And in particular, if Scotland does have the power to vary the rates of income tax, what might Scotland be able to do with them, and what is it likely to be able to do with them? How much more or less income tax are you going to be likely to pay as a result of these particular changes? So let's try and look at the background to that particular question. Joe has talked a bit about the structure of the Scottish budget so far. Public expenditure in Scotland runs to These are, as Joe has described, GERS figures. Public expenditure in Scotland runs to about £65 billion, of which the Scottish Government spends about 60% of it. Tax raised in Scotland runs to about 48 billion, and a geographic share of North Sea oil would be another 5 to 6. Obviously, that last item varies very considerably from year to year, and in this particular year, not in a very favourable direction. But that's a typical amount over the last few years. If you ask for a breakdown of these tax receipts in Scotland, you will see that income tax and VAT both account for about 10 billion of that tax which is raised in Scotland. That is, each of them account for about 20% of the total of tax that is raised here. And the other taxes we're talking about, air passenger duty, landfill taxes, aggregates, and stamp duties or their replacements, are almost inconsequential in relation to, in their revenue impact, in relation to these big taxes I'm talking about there. So the issue is primarily income tax. What is going to happen to your income tax? Well, let's start with a few facts that tell us about that. As you, I was going to say will know, but as you may know, the basic structure of income tax in the UK at present has 3 rates of income tax. There is the basic rate of 20%, which you pay on income in excess of a little more than 10,000 a year. There is the higher rate of income tax, which is 40%, which you pay on income over a little more than 40,000 a year. And there is the additional rate of income tax, the super higher rate, which was introduced in 2010 at 50%, has since been reduced to 45%, but which applies only to incomes over 150,000 a year. So there are these 3 basic rates. There are these 3 rates of tax: the basic rate, the higher rate, and the additional rate. And you'll see HMRC's estimates, well, their figures for the number of people in the UK who pay tax at each of these rates, and you will see their estimates of the number of people in Scotland who pay tax at each of these rates. You will notice that the proportion who pay tax at the basic rate is a little bit higher than Scotland's population share. Higher rate is marginally lower, additional rate is quite a bit lower. The number of people who pay the additional rate of income tax who are resident in Scotland is something between 15 and 18,000 people. You can almost write down a list of who they are, in fact. And if you go to the Departure Business Lounge at Edinburgh Airport, I think you will meet a fair proportion of them. That's quite an important fact, which I shall come back to in a moment. That's where income tax revenue comes from people paying tax at these different rates. But how much do we get at each of these rates? These are the figures for the UK as a whole, for which about 150 billion is raised in total in income tax, at the basic rate, at the higher rate, and the additional rate. And you will see from that basic rate taxpayers pay a bit more than a third, higher rate taxpayers pay slightly more than a third, additional rate taxpayers, of whom there are not very many, pay slightly less than a third. Very roughly, it divides equally into the amounts paid by taxpayers in each of these 3 bands. Now, if you look at these figures, you might think that the additional rate, and indeed the higher rate, is raising a lot of revenue. And indeed, people have looked at these figures and some of them interpreted them in that kind of way. But that's wrong. And the reason it's wrong, and this is a very important point to understanding how to interpret these figures, is that most of the tax which is being paid by people who pay these higher rates is actually tax which they are paying at the lower rates. If that sounds complicated, let me try and explain it a bit further. I'm asking here how much people in each of these categories pay as a result of the existence of that particular rate. And you'll see that about 80%, in fact, of total tax is paid at the basic rate. In other words, if we were to abolish the higher and additional rate of tax, we would lose only about 20% of total tax revenue. Because although people at the higher rate who pay tax at the higher rate pay quite a lot of income tax, most of the income tax they pay is payable at the basic rate. And that's what gets us to the figure that the amount of revenue which the additional rate raises is only about £3 billion, even though additional rate taxpayers pay an amount of income tax which totals £40 billion. If you're to ask how the Scottish Government might affect the revenue which it derives from income tax by varying the rates, it's vital to understand that aspect of the way in which income tax revenue is made up. Because let us look at the one measure which so far has been specifically proposed by actually both the major parties in Scotland in terms of what they would do if they were to get these additional tax-raising powers, which is to raise the additional rate back to the 50% level, which it was for 2 years from 2010. Now, the important point here is to see that most of what additional rate taxpayers pay, they pay at the lower rates. If we were to raise the additional rate back to 50% from its current 45%, and behaviour remained unchanged, I think these 18,000 people would pay approximately slightly more than 100 million in additional tax to the Scottish Exchequer. But would behaviour remain unchanged? When I mentioned that a lot of these people could be found in the departure lounge at Edinburgh Airport, that wasn't entirely a jokey observation. I don't think, as a practical matter, that many people would leave Scotland as a result of jacking up an additional rate from 45 to 50%. The effect of these kind of changes on where people are resident is often exaggerated. But I'm willing to bet that a high proportion of these 18,000 people, certainly a high proportion of those of the 18,000 people I know, have residences outside Scotland as well as inside Scotland. And it only requires a relatively small number of people to discover that they are not resident in Scotland after all, to have a rather large impact on the revenue which is raised, not just from the additional rates of tax, but from the lower rates of tax. I've, in my career in tax, which actually goes back to when Gavin described getting involved in the Institute for Fiscal Studies over 30 years ago, in my career in tax, I've not been impressed often by arguments that if you raise this particular rate of tax, you will actually lose revenue rather than gain it. But actually, in raising the additional rate of tax in Scotland from 45 to 50%, I'm fairly certain that I've finally found a case of that particular kind. Now that actually creates an extraordinary paradox because Joe has already mentioned the no detriment principle which is enshrined in the Smith Agreement. The no detriment proposal is there to deal with a case in which the actions of one government have a negative effect on the revenues of another. The one effect that we can look with reasonable confidence to is the paradoxical one that raising the additional rate of income tax in Scotland will increase tax revenues in England. Now, if the no detriment principle applies in both directions, and the white paper appears to imply it does, then it would seem that England would have to compensate Scotland for this additional revenue. I suspect the chances of a cheque for that amount from coming north of the border are actually rather small. But as Joe has indicated, both the Barnett consequential issues and the application of the no detriment principle are things that are very complicated and are going to be the subject of dispute and negotiation. I've talked then about the one change to which parties are currently committed in terms of varying the Scottish rate of income tax. Let's look at the other things that a Scottish government might do. Here are some of them. It might raise the higher rate of income tax. That is the 40% rate. Now, I think that you would actually raise revenue from doing that. I don't think that's in the category of the effects of 1% on the additional rate. But 1% on the higher rate of income tax, that is raising the higher rate from 40% to 41%, would raise about £100 million for the Scottish Exchequer. So raising the higher rate of income tax from 40 to 45% would raise about £500 million. That's about 1%, you'll recall, of total revenue in Scotland. Raising the basic rate of income tax, on the other hand, does start to be rather more significant. 1% on the basic rate of income tax brings in about 500 million. Now, technically, the Scottish Government doesn't have the power to raise the personal allowance. That is, at the moment you can earn about £10,000 free of income tax, and that's something that will remain fixed by the UK government. But while the Scottish Government can't raise that amount, one thing the Scottish Government could do is actually introduce a 0 or a 10% rate of tax on the first band of income over and above that threshold, so that introducing a 0 band of income tax is equivalent for all practical purposes to raising the personal allowance. But of course, it's actually quite expensive. Raising the personal allowance by £1,000 in Scotland in that way would cost about £500 million. Equivalently, introducing a 10% rate of tax on the first £2,000 over and above that £10,000 figure would also cost about £500 million. It's quite useful, I think, to think in £500 million units. It may seem a lot to you and me, but that's the way Chancellors of the Exchequer or Cabinet Secretaries for Finance actually have to think about these issues. Another way of doing it would be to introduce perhaps a 30% rate of income tax in between the existing 20% band and the existing 40% band. I think if you started that band at about 32,000 of income, as against the current 42,000 at which the higher rate kicks in of 40%, I think that too would raise about £500 million. And you'll see that together I'm starting to put together a package of what a Scottish government might actually be able to do. For example, you could introduce a 10% band on the first 2,000 of income over and above the threshold. You could introduce a 30% rate instead of the present 20% on incomes over and above more than £30,000, more than £20,000 above the tax threshold. That would be incomes in total of about £32,000, a bit over average incomes in Scotland, but although still low enough to bring quite a lot of people into that tax. And a 40% band as at the moment, and a 50% band, which, as I've suggested, the Labour and SN Party and SNP are currently committed to, but I doubt if it will raise any revenue at all. The package I'm describing would actually be more or less revenue neutral, I think. You'd have 4 bands of income tax of 10, 20, 30, 40, 50%. It looks like a rather progressive schedule. The key implication for most people, or many people, is the existence of a 30% rate that comes in at incomes a little bit above 30%, £30,000, so it raises the marginal rate of tax for quite a lot of people. But if one is to model a restructuring of income tax on the kind of way that Joe has described for the land and building transactions tax, that is the sort of thing you might do. And if I were to predict what the outcome of introducing the kind of provisions which are in the Smith Commission, that is the prediction of what we might end up with in 5 years' time for a structure of income tax in Scotland. Let me make one final point, which is to say that none of the changes I've described is likely to raise amounts of additional revenue which will be very large in relation to the total budget of the Scottish Government. If I were to think about kind of the most draconian tax measures which I could visualize, which would probably involve raising the basic rate of income tax from its current 20% to 25%, and raising the higher rate of income tax from its current 40% to 50%. And in the face of the potential for tax competition that Joe has described between Scotland and the rest of the United Kingdom, I think that's about as much as you could do without genuinely provoking some significant exodus of people from Scotland. That in total might raise about £3 billion in additional revenue. That's actually rather less than the over-expenditure that results from Scotland getting more than its population share of total expenditure on devolved functions currently. It's significantly less than 10% of total Scottish government spending and less than 5% of total public spending in Scotland. That's what would be involved, I think, in what has been described as moving Scotland to a Scandinavian-type tax and spending regime. I haven't spelled out in detail the Barnett consequentials of all the things I've been describing. I'm happy to start that process, in discussion we have. But in conclusion, I would say, first of all, I think when it comes to additional powers, be frightened of what you wish for. And finally, the title of that white paper that was published in February, An Enduring Settlement, seems to me a declaration of quite extraordinary optimism. Thank you.
Hi everyone. I feel slightly guilty because after John talking to you and offering solutions and suggestions and constructive ways in which the new powers might be used, I'm afraid I'm going to go back to talk about the problems and some of the, I think, disincentives perhaps for using some of the powers at all. Although I would agree that I think in many areas, and including in the welfare area, which I've been asked to focus on, there are almost guarantees that this is unlikely to be a settlement that will endure. I want to talk about two questions around the area of welfare in the draft legislation, and that's whether the legislation, the clauses that will make up the bones of a Scotland bill, whether they honour in full the spirit of the Smith report, or whether some things have been lost in that translation from the recommendations of the Smith Commission to the draft clauses. And the second question is to think through what the implications will be for governing what will become a new and much more complex devolution settlement to emerge from this process, including in the welfare area. So first then, thinking of from Smith to the draft clauses. In terms of the devolved benefits that were proposed, the Smith Commission, to remind us, recommended full devolution or complete autonomy, to use the phrase used in the Smith report, of a range of welfare benefits focused mainly on benefits for people with disabilities and their carers, and non-contributory benefits mainly for the elderly. That amounts to around about 14% of social security spending in Scotland, around £2.5 billion. Those recommendations are largely incorporated into the draft legislation by way of exceptions to a general reservation on social security in the Schedule 5 reservations of the original Scotland Act. There's one exception to that, which appears to be an oversight, which is in terms of winter fuel payments. For some reason, that doesn't make it into the draft clauses, but I think that's just an oversight. But in incorporating those proposals into draft legislation, there are specificities, if that's the right way to get my tongue around that, restrictions perhaps in the way that they are clearly defined in the draft clauses, which arguably introduce some challenges, at least, to the complete autonomy that was envisaged within the Smith report. For example, clauses relating to discretionary housing payments are defined very strictly. Carers' benefit is predefined within the draft clauses as eligible only to those who are 16 or over, not in full-time education or gainfully employed. So if a future Scottish Government wanted to change the entitlements around carers' benefit, the draft legislation as it is written would prohibit them from doing so. Significant constraints would also occur in relation to those devolved benefits if the Scottish Government decided to share bureaucracy with the UK Government through the Department of Works and Pensions, which is an option that would be open to it subject to negotiation instead of setting up its own welfare bureaucracy. That would be a matter for the Scottish Parliament to decide. It's not a matter of legislation, but it would pose a significant constraint on the complete autonomy that was envisaged. In relation to universal credit is currently being rolled out across the UK to merge and replace 6 benefits and tax credits, job seekers allowance, housing benefit, working tax credit, child tax credit, employment support allowance, and income support. And the recommendation in Smith was that that remain a reserved matter. That remains something that would be the responsibility of the UK government and not devolved. And there are some good reasons for that. Expenditure around those benefits is quite volatile, it's dependent on changes in the economic cycle, it can be very difficult to predict. And so there is a rationale underpinning that recommendation. The Smith Commission also recommended that universal credit that the Scottish Government be entitled to negotiate arrangements to deliver universal credit differently in Scotland, alter the delivery arrangements of universal credit, and that the Scottish Parliament be entitled to vary the housing cost element of universal credit, which would include a capacity to vary the bit of universal credit that links to, the bit of housing benefit that links to the under-occupancy charge, or bedroom tax as it's better known, local housing allowance rates, eligible rent and deductions for non-payment. Within the draft clauses, these provisions appear but subject to consultation and agreement. And you might recall that there was a lot of fuss made at the time of the publication of the draft legislation that the clauses effectively amounted to a veto for the relevant UK Secretary of State over the new devolved powers. The draft clauses note that those powers would be subject to consultation with the UK Secretary of State on the practicability of any new arrangements and on agreement to when these changes can be reasonably implemented. Now, my own view is that what counts as practicable and reasonable in terms of the proposals or the time frame is very much in the eye of the beholder and is difficult to define in constitutional terms. But in practice, so long as universal credit remains a reserved matter, designed and delivered by the UK government, legislated by the UK Parliament, any changes that were to be made in those areas where the Scottish Government had discretion could only be implemented by cooperation and agreement between the two governments. Now, it's a legitimate question, I think, to pose whether you therefore need to have any restrictions within the legislation itself as to whether there is a constitutional requirement to come to agreement. The other main area of welfare, linked to welfare, which is proposed for devolution, is around employment support. The Smith Commission recommended that all powers for support for those people who are facing unemployment that is currently contracted out by Department of Works and Pensions be devolved to the Scottish Government. That makes it into the draft clauses, but in a way that is both more restrictive and possibly more extensive. So the more restrictive bit is that it's specifically about people who are at risk of long-term unemployment and specifically linked to assistance that is for at least a year. Potentially the more extensive bit is that there says nothing about contracted provision in the draft clauses, so that potentially opens up new possibilities should the current contracts be redesigned and delivered in a completely different way. The spirit of Smith is more dimly reflected in the proposals to create new welfare powers. The Smith Commission had proposed that the Scottish Parliament be given, quote, new powers to create new benefits in areas of devolved responsibility. Now, that was an ambiguous proposal, but it was widely interpreted as paving the way to new and potentially innovative welfare benefits related to any area of devolved responsibility, of course subject to available finance, and we've already heard that there might not be all that much money available. But that was a general power which was also intended to be combined with a power to top up reserved benefits. Now, none of this was spelled out within the Smith Commission report, and it doesn't really appear at all in the draft clauses. Excuse me. The draft clauses, rather, instead talk about the power to replace these particular social security benefits that are identified as being specific for devolution this time around, rather than a more general power. And there is no power to top up general benefits at all. Why this is the case, I think, relates to the approach that was taken within the Smith Commission, which was focused on allocating new powers or identifying new powers to be allocated to the Scottish Parliament and the Scottish Government, rather than re-examining the powers that were reserved specifically within the original devolution settlement. The Scotland Act 1998 lists within Schedule 5 those areas that are explicitly reserved, including within that control over social security, including pensions, national insurance benefits and other cash transfers to individuals, quote, for social security purposes. The draft legislation doesn't alter that general reservation, but instead it adds a complex array of exception upon exception to the general reservation. And I think so long as that general reservation remains in place, it will be very difficult to incorporate either a general power to create new benefits in devolved areas or to top up reserved benefits, as the Smith report had arguably intended. And then to my second point. Overall, the draft clauses reveal the complexity of the new devolution settlement, which creates a need for a much closer system for cooperation between the Scottish Government and the UK Government, not just to implement the new powers that emerge from this settlement, but to manage the interdependencies that the new settlement will create on an ongoing basis. And the Smith report recognised that in calling for an urgent scaling up of intergovernmental relations, both bilaterally between the two governments and multilaterally involving the UK government on all of the devolved administrations. Now that interdependence, that complexity is, I think, especially evident in the area of welfare or social security, where benefits to be devolved can act as a passport to benefits and other exemptions that will continue to remain reserved. And some recipients of reserved benefits, those other universal credit benefits, for example, will retain an entitlement, a passport to the bit of universal credit that would be devolved around housing benefit, the housing cost element, over which the Scottish Parliament would have a say. Intergovernmental working would also be absolutely central to the application of the principle of no detriment that we've already heard about. The principle that was set out within the financial framework bit of the Smith report indicated that neither government should be adversely affected as either a result of the devolution of further powers or, and this is the really difficult bit, or of the policy decisions that are taken after devolution. The implication is that the policy decisions of one government that are considered to have a detrimental impact on the other would require some form of financial compensation. The clearest example that's been given is the example of air passenger duty that John mentioned. If you apply the no detriment principle to the full, you wouldn't just have that cost that you estimated for having air passenger duty within Scotland, but the implication is that there would be an additional cost that you would have to pay in compensation to those parts of the north of England that were adversely affected by that policy decision. If you take an example that the UK government's command paper also implies in relation to the work programme or its equivalent, those employment support programmes for people who are unemployed. If these are to be designed and delivered by the Scottish Government and they fail to meet the Department of Work and Pensions expectations and targets for getting the long-term unemployed back to work, would the Scottish Government be expected to foot the bill for the higher than expected benefit costs that the DWP then incurred. The principle of no detriment suggests that that would be the outcome, and it would potentially also work in reverse. In any multi-level system, like the UK, or in any federal system, there is always going to be what we call policy overspills. There's always going to be the case where the decisions of one government affect the responsibilities of another. That can't be avoided in a multi-level system. But establishing a system to manage those sorts of overspills by means of financial compensation for detrimental impacts is both highly unusual and incredibly difficult to manage in a way that would satisfy both governments and not generate new grievances. Those complex issues, those interdependencies, point to the need for much more effective intergovernmental machinery than we currently have, machinery that nurtures cooperation and coordination between ministers as well as officials charged with developing and implementing policy. Unless that kind of joint working operates on the basis of an equality of status, if not of power, and of mutual respect, of a mechanism for resolving disputes which is seen as fair to both parties, then I think we will be returning to this settlement sooner than many hope. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. We now have about 55 minutes for questions and discussion. And I suggest that I take the questions 3 at a time and invite the speakers then to comment on them and reply. So who would like to start? One here at the front. Can I have 2 more? 2 at the front. Right, let's start with that and see how we get on.
Ian McLean, Oxford University. I think John's numbers are very seriously scary, and I'm not sure that even John's demeanour really conveyed how scary they seem to be, because I understood him to be saying that if the Scottish Government goes for a tax-raising strategy at the upper level of the income tax changes that you suggest are possible, it now faces a large hole in its current budget compared to the current expenditure by the Scottish Government, which, as far as I can see, can only be met either by serious cuts in public expenditure, possibly by serious increases in council tax and or business rates, which John didn't discuss, but I can't see any other way. And this is not what the Scottish people thought they were voting for, whether they voted SNP or for one of the unionist parties, because I think no party in the last Scottish election or in the referendum campaign was alerting the Scottish people to those realities. I'm very happy to, for John or Joe to say that I'm over-interpreting what John said, but I rather fear that I'm not.
Thank you.
Jim Gallagher, thank you very much for that. One of the messages I drew from that is, oh dear, it's all very difficult, perhaps we shouldn't have bothered, was rather the tone of rather too much of that. And to be honest, I think that is the wrong tone to take. It's the wrong tone for 2 reasons, but there's a very big political demand in Scotland for more power and more autonomy for the Scottish Parliament. And to say it's all very difficult and it will all be very complicated, and if you try to use the powers, they'll blow up in your face, seems to me to take rather a defeatist kind of an attitude. All governments have to face these choices. All governments have, as Nicola said, to find ways of working together in a multi-level arrangement. All governments have to deal with policy spillovers, and all federal states have to manage tax competition. So none of these things is impossible. And I'm slightly worried that the overall tone of the presentations was to suggest that we should just dust it all away and forget about it. Now, I take no responsibility for the recommendations of the Smith Commission. It wasn't me, mister. in several respects. But all of, certainly two of the speakers, had quite good fun subjecting the principle of no detriment to the kind of analysis that might be relevant if it was a piece of statute rather than a couple of throwaway words in a political deal. What you'll remember, if you look at it, of course, this principle was first enunciated in the implementation of the Scotland Act 2012, when it was used to mean that if the UK government altered the tax base, the income tax base, it would compensate the Scottish government for any shortfall that created in its revenue from the Scottish income tax, and vice versa, via an alteration to the grant. Now, I agree that if you took it literally, you could produce all sorts of daft propositions. The Scottish government doesn't do very well in economic development, and it reduces the UK government's VAT income, so it should compensate it for that. One can produce absurd examples, and any administration is going to have to set a practical boundary to that principle. I thought I'd be interested in, from the speakers, is where they think that practical boundary lies. Just how far down the chain of causation should you go? And my second question is for John. He used the magic phrase Barnett consequential, which does trip off the tongue really quite easily, certainly in Scottish financial discussions. But he didn't then talk about them. In fact, none of the things he said talked about expenditure at all. Didn't mention Barnett, didn't mention the consequential system, and none of the changes to income tax that he mentioned would generate any Barnett consequentials one way or another. So would he please talk about them?
Right. Would you like to go first?
Right. I think there are two broad groups of issues that come out of this. The first for me is the basic problem, which the Smith Commission was about, which has brought us here today, is that the referendum campaign, and particularly the last few weeks of it, created expectations that cannot possibly be realised. More than that, there's a widespread set of expectations in Scotland about the impact of devolution and/or independence that cannot possibly be realised. At its, if one were to put it in crude terms, what people in Scotland want is not really so much more powers as more money to spend on the powers that already exist. And if you doubted that, then I suggest you go back to the Scottish Government's white paper on the implications of independence, in which a large majority of the things that were in it that would be good about an independent Scotland were things that Scotland already has the power to do with the existing settlement, but does not have the money to do. And neither the Smith report nor independence is going to create out of thin air the money to do these things. It is possible that either might in the long run have effects on the dynamism of the Scottish economy that would create additional possibilities for revenue and spending, but that is something that has to happen over the long term and is a long way down the track. It is not going to happen as a result of any particular piece of legislation of the kind we're describing. And that brings one to the point which is behind what Ian is saying, which is that essentially the elephant in the room, which no one is willing to discuss, is that Scotland already gets too much money as a result of the Barnett formula. That political roadblock is something that gets in the way of sensible discussion about a properly devolved structure. Now, Jim Gallagher is right. Having raised the phrase Barnett consequentials, I didn't talk about them. I was only given 15 minutes, and I thought I could usefully spend that 15 minutes by talking about one aspect of it, of what is in Smith that has not yet been widely discussed. Although it ought to have been, because since the largest element in Smith was the devolution of income tax, one has to put that against the very striking fact that for the last 15 years the Scottish Government has had the power to vary income tax in Scotland and has not only not used it, but has not even come close to using it in that period. So we have to start by analysing what the Scottish Government could actually do in terms of income tax. But let's start the business of talking about Barnett consequentials. Because if I'm to talk about Barnett consequentials in relation to income tax, and this is where it relates to the no detriment issue as well, the essential Barnett consequential is that if any change is made to the structure of income tax in England, that has to be reflected in an adjustment to the block grant to Scotland, which is in effect equivalent to the amount which the changes to the income tax position in England would have raised in Scotland if they had been applied to Scotland. If that sounds surprising and complicated, let me explain the logic of it, which is to say that if the government in England raises or lowers expenditure, it can do so either in relation to a devolved function or in relation to a reserved function. Suppose it's a devolved function. The English government abolishes the National Health Service in England and reduces income tax in Scotland. Then what will happen as a result of the mechanical application of the Barnett formula is that the allocation of grant to Scotland will be reduced, reflecting the reduction in health expenditure in England. That means in order to enable the Scottish Government to have the choice of either reducing its own taxes or maintaining a health service in Scotland, there has to be an increase in the grant to Scotland equivalent to the income tax benefit to people in England. Alternatively, the UK government decides to raise income tax in England to spend on a reserved function, e.g. The UK declares war on the European Union and raises income tax in order to pay for it. Then in that case, to maintain Scotland's share, as it were, of the costs of this military adventure, there will have to be a reduction in the Barnett grant to Scotland, which Scotland will have to implement, will force Scotland either to raise income tax itself or accept reductions in other spending to meet the military costs. That is, whatever happens to England, to income tax in England, and this seems at first sight surprising, that has to be reflected in an adjustment to the block grant to Scotland through the Barnett system. That's the central Barnett consequential. And that's the way in which this principle of no detriment will, in reality, operate. It is, in fact, I think, the only way in which it will operate in reality. As Joe has implied, and I think everyone else who has thought about it implied, the idea that the no detriment principle could actually be implemented in the way in which the white paper implies it will be implemented is, I think, quite unrealistic and improbable.
Thank you. I think John has just really explained why the proposal to have English laws for English, whatever it is a flawed proposal in the part of the UK government. Because if Scots MPs are excluded from these kind of discussions, and these discussions affect Scotland nevertheless, then this is a problem. However, can I have some...
That's right, Gavin. There is no expenditure issue in England that does not potentially have implications for Scotland.
Can I pick up
Yes,
a couple
okay.
of the points? Because I think Jim, in his inimitable way, was teasing that there's a groundswell of opinion that we need to have massive new powers. I think Sorry. I'll say it again because it sounded quite nice. Jim was teasing us. The groundswell of desire for more powers, I think, has, if it's true, has risen as a consequence of austerity measures, i.e. funding cuts, a belief of North Sea tax revenue being wasted, and a desire to maintain the, dare I say it, the extra spend for Scotland over and above what we're currently getting, because it's our birthright. I think it's wrong to say there is a massive desire for additional powers when you start to talk to people about the complexity and the risks that's actually going to generate as a consequence of taking responsibility for all of your own spending based on all of your own revenues, including within North Sea revenues. But if you take North Sea revenues out of the equation, then it does start to beg the question: why do we get above per capita revenue in Scotland? One might argue at the moment that we are getting above per capita spending in Scotland because of North Sea revenues historically. And that's the benefit of the North Sea. So that starts to wind down, and at the moment we're getting about £7 billion a year more than we're currently generating in revenues. If you take North Sea out of the equation, then it starts to beg the question: why are we entitled to a higher per capita spend in Scotland than the other parts of the UK, and principally the North East and the North West, or the North East and the South West, sorry. So I think the groundswell of desire for more tax changes has come from that background. My belief about the complexity, my belief and my desire for a slowing down of the process isn't to say that the process is necessarily unwanted if there is a serious desire for that, but to put together a package of additional tax powers within less than 6 months without the evidence to support the rationale for it, I think beggars belief as an economist. To implement it in equally swift time, I think, would be irresponsible. So my desire is not to say stop. That's a political will and a politically negotiated settlement, and political negotiated settlements produce throwaway lines like no detriment, no betterment. But it behoves us as economists and professionals to say, if you implement at haste, you will struggle as a consequence. And whilst there are flaws with the Barnett consequentials and there are flaws with the block grant arrangement, it has created a degree of certainty that we now need to deal with, because it is going to be much more uncertain. And that's not to say it's bad, it's just to say it's quite different to what we currently have. And I'm not sure we're all necessarily ready for it, so we implement much more slowly than we've put the legislation on the statute books.
Can I have some more questions now? One here. There must be more questions after all this talking. Another one over there. That's two. Is there a third? Thank you, a third, yes. This one first.
Hi, yeah. Stephen Watson, mathematician, University of Glasgow. I guess I've got questions for all, but I'm sort of specifically drawn to John Kay's comments. I sort of would like to clear up when he makes these statements as he made about Scotland in some way getting more than its fair share. I guess Joe has somewhat defended that by mentioning that one has to factor in all of Scotland's income. And if you do look at tax receipts over the last 30 years or so, you'll see that your claims don't quite stack up if you do incorporate North Sea tax. But putting that aside, I guess I want to explore a couple of things. The first thing is, no mention of Devo Max has been made here. And all of these discussions may in fact turn out to be somewhat premature, given that the general election may turn up some interesting consequences. And indeed, the upsurge in enthusiasm for the SNP across Scotland does speak to, in some way, a possibility for major change to the settlement as we're currently discussing it. But the thing I'm specifically interested in, and this does touch on the Devo Max question, is the infrastructure issue. So one of the things I was struck by in the statistics that John put up about tax distributions is he did actually show us a breakdown percentage, 1/3 at the lower rate of tax, 1/3 at the mid rate, and 1/3 at the higher rate across the UK, but you did not show us a similar pie chart for Scotland, although one could somehow back out and infer from some of the data you gave that that's not exactly how it breaks down. Basically, Scotland's economy is a low-wage economy, predominantly at the bottom end, and for me this all relates to infrastructure questions. So again, my question really is this: the powers that are needed, in my view, relate to investment in, if you like, an advanced economy. So let me give you one statistic to throw out there, which I garnered from the independence debate, which related to science and innovation expenditure in Scotland. It is 20% less per capita than the rest of the UK. And that's something important to focus on, given a couple of things. Given that the higher education sector here is second to none in terms of its effectiveness at raising grant money, but indeed there is a poor correlation between that and what's happening in the innovation side. So perhaps, again, I'd like to try and advance the discussion a little beyond where we currently are with Smith, because I think we cannot predict exactly how that's going to play out. And let's start imagining, and I'd like to hear some of those imaginings, what's possible. Why not the simplicity of Devo Max, if there was an appetite for it, and what would be possible through that?
So William Reid now.
William Reid, an old hack. Could I ask the panel, whose observations I found extremely helpful, what the effect is going to be of all these negotiations on the administrative on-costs? What are the staffing implications? Nobody seems to talk very much about that, but I'm sure they're quite significant.
And the third point over here.
I'm a bit of a layperson, so this might be kind of a stupid question, but would it be possible to possibly raise more money from the top rate of tax? Would the Scottish Government have the power to do this by clamping down on tax avoidance?
Much. Right. Who would like to tackle that?
Can I come on?
Nicola, yeah.
Yeah. I'm going to address your questions around Devo Max and at the same time respond to Jim's earlier comment, which was almost a criticism of us being whinging. I make no apologies for pointing out what I think are the difficulties with the current proposals, and they are proposals in a way. This is draft of draft legislation to be returned to after the general election. Oh dear. Oh God, I've put the lights out. Had it now. Oh God. So the results of the general election are clearly uncertain, both in Scotland and at the UK level. This is a live debate, and I think it is incumbent on us to point out some of the problems that we see with the current proposals before they're implemented, rather than to wait until afterwards. But with respect to the issue of Devo Max, I don't know what it is. Okay, I've never seen a set of concrete proposals that would, Devo Max is as fluid as independence was, okay, in terms of the scale of things that you could be talking about here. Is there more scope for a different kind of devolution settlement than the one that's currently on the table? Yes. Would I have started from where the Smith Commission started? No. I think it would be much clearer, potentially, if you start by looking and re-examining the reserve powers and maintain the integrity of a reserve powers model rather than drift away from it, which I think is what we are in danger of doing. And if you want to know the problems that result from that, just speak to the Welsh. On the issue of administration, I think you're absolutely right. I touched upon it a little bit, and the administrative costs will depend upon how much administration the Scottish Government takes on. So in the area of social security, for example, if they were to set up a social security bureaucracy to administer those new benefits, then we don't know how much that would cost, but they would have to incur the costs of doing so and the additional costs of changing the delivery arrangements, even for those benefits that are delivered through the Department for Works and Pensions. So there is a cost to administration, but there's a cost to not having your own administration too. Effectively, if you don't have your own administration, there's not an awful lot you could do in terms of the legislative autonomy that would be coming north of the border. So it's a trade-off between a financial cost and an autonomy cost. similar issues around income tax, I think, but there is no prospect at the moment that the income tax devolution would come with a separate administration. That the proposals that would envisage that would continue to be done through HMRC, but with the costs incurred by the Scottish Government.
John, do you want to say anything about Devo Max?
I don't think I can say anything better than what Nicola has said. I don't know what Devo Max means. There are other groups of devolution proposals than the ones in the white paper, and the ones in the white paper are not a particularly good set, and certainly not the set that many people would come up with, looking at it rationally in the way Nicola has described.
I think there's a fair amount of confusion about Devo Max. I mean, what I've assumed it meant was that all taxes would be raised by Scottish authorities, and they would be responsible also for all expenditure, and they would pay something to the UK for the Queen and for defence and for foreign services and international aid and so on. That actually amounts to independence without really being independence. It means that you still have the common currency, and it's very unusual for that sort of situation to work, actually, because it runs into all kinds of problems. But I don't think we're here to discuss that, really, but I just wanted to clarify what perhaps it meant. Can we have 3 more questions?
Gavin, there are 1 or 2 questions. Other questions that need Sorry, there are 1 or 2 other questions that I think need answered. The answer to the question, would, under what is proposed, the Scottish Government be able to raise more money from higher rates of tax by reducing tax avoidance? The answer to that is no, because the power to determine the base and everything that goes around that continues to remain with the UK Government. And the other question I'd like to raise, the other point I'd like to make, it is right that over the last 20, 30 years, on average, the excess per capita public spending in Scotland is roughly equal on average to the additional revenue which is attributable to Scotland in relation to the North Sea. The point I wish to make is simply, if we believe, and this goes back to Gavin's description a moment ago, that there is the nature of a union, whether one's in favour of it or not, is that there is some pooling of resources and some recognition of common needs. If that is the position, it is difficult to defend the current position of Scotland as other than anomalously favourable.
Can I also just pick up on the North Sea issue? Certainly during the referendum discussion, a lot was made about the revenues over the last 30 years. And yes, we have had significant additional revenues over the last 30 years. 2 points. One, what happened before then, i.e. before 74, when we didn't have North Sea tax revenues. And secondly, and more importantly, what's happening now, when we're actually seeing North Sea tax revenues falling, and an ageing infrastructure that is going to be more expensive to maintain. It's not going to generate North Sea revenues, but they're not going to be anything like what we saw over the last 30 years. So the last 30 years probably were atypical.
Can we have 3 more questions? Everyone seems to be stunned to silence. I don't quite understand why. Yep, there's 1 question there.
Hi, I think I may have misunderstood, but from the way you guys described it, it seems that whatever additional money the Scottish Government is able to make up through additional taxation, they would lose from the Barnett formula. No? Okay, then my question is void.
Any more questions? Yeah, the front here.
Is there any,
just a moment, the microphone's coming.
Are there any important lessons to be learned from the mini-devolution of fiscal powers and other powers to Greater London and the proposed extension of similar devolution to the northern powerhouse of Greater Manchester? Is that just going to create even more problems for the UK?
Right, who would like to take that one?
It's not similar. And I think in a lot of those cases, particularly in some of the northern regions, there is the risk that there is the possibility that what's being devolved is risk rather than meaningful power to manage new things. I don't think it's comparable, but what is interesting is that there are parallel processes taking place throughout the UK that are devolution of a sort. They're not coherent, and there's a lot of debate now as to whether that's a problem. I mean, I have a fairly pragmatic view about this. I think that the UK is a pragmatic entity, and if you start to try to make everything coherent, that's probably when it will start to fall apart. So there are risks in that. But what isn't clear yet, and what I think does need to be addressed, is that if the bits around the UK are to be changed and to take on additional powers and responsibilities, the centre has to change too. And to date, there has been fairly minimal change in Whitehall in particular around, as a result of devolution. And I think I think particularly English Votes for English Laws would imply a change in the way that the UK government in its bureaucracy manages devolution and the different arrangements around the UK.
Yeah.
Could I just make 2 points? First of all, about the devolution of powers to the north of England. At the moment, what seems to be envisaged is passing a substantial amount of expenditure to the cities in the north of England for the health service. That seems to me to be a good way of Whitehall getting out of the problem of worrying about the health service. And the problems will then all be blamed on the authorities in the north of England. There isn't any more money than is presently being spent. So I'm not quite sure what the advantage of this is. The second point I wanted to make was just to clarify on the public expenditure thing. Scottish public expenditure, according to the Scottish Government's own figures, is 10% higher than the UK average at the moment per head. If you sum that by the number of people in Scotland, then that comes to about 7 billion, which is what Joe said. At the moment, that's covered by the Barnett formula. If the Barnett formula wasn't there, it would have to be covered by Scottish revenue. North Sea oil revenue would in some years be quite enough to cover that, but certainly not at the moment, and it's very volatile.
Can I pick up the issue about devolution, the Greater London experience and Manchester? I do think there is a desire for federalism of sorts around finances. Clearly Northern Ireland's been arguing for and going to get corporation tax powers. There's a desire in different areas to take more control of their own affairs because they think they're being shortchanged by Whitehall. I mean, I think there was a piece of work done by the Institute for Fiscal Studies that showed that the Scottish and Northern Ireland governments receive significantly more taxes than Wales and England from the treatment of non-domestic rates in the application of the Barnett formula. So when you start to unpick the Barnett formula, it's been stable, but it's a black box. As you start to unpick it, you start to see there are serious anomalies within it. Trying to deal with those anomalies creates winners and losers, and you clearly feel that the winners shout loud and hard to get it, and the losers are disgruntled and therefore want more power. So we're in that space at the moment, as I said, because of the austerity effects, because people are feeling that they're not getting their fair share or they're taking a disproportionate cut. They therefore want more control of their local powers. And I agree with Nicola, that does mean Whitehall needs to treat the regions, the countries within the UK differently. It's not clear that they're going to do that at the moment.
I mean, I think there are several points there. One is that in relation to the Barnett formula as a whole, if you want to arrive at an enduring settlement, in inverted commas, the way you reach that settlement is not you take levels of public expenditure in 1977-78 and make a large series of ad hoc adjustments to them over time and through legislation. And I would also pick up a point Nicola made about the centre changing. it seems to me much of the spirit of the white paper is written, and much of the other discussion of devolution to England is written in the spirit of you can have powers to do something different so long as you don't actually do something different. And anyone who is familiar with the attitudes of the UK Treasury, or indeed many UK politicians, will understand where that kind of thinking comes from.
Some more questions, yes.
Thinking of a number of countries which
Thinking of a number of countries which have sought to solve problems by moving their capitals from a peripheral location to a central one. Nigeria is one example, Brazil another. Would it be practicable or desirable to do that in the UK, say move it to Liverpool?
I think your examples give the answer to the question, don't they?
James VI wanted the capital of the UK to be in York, which is something which not many people understand. Might have been a good thing if he'd won that out, but the English Parliament stopped him and objected.
Mind you, it does sound like the Houses of Parliament are about to collapse, so maybe there's a desire now to find a cheaper house rather than
Royal High School.
Yes.
Can I have 3 more questions, please? Yes, lots of hands going up now.
This is more a comment. I would say Hexham rather than York. But no one seems to have considered that Edinburgh is having the same effect on Scotland, and this effect can only grow, as the effect that London has on the UK in general. And that's where trouble will eventually come with more devolution.
Thank you. Erland Clouston, a semi-retired hack. I have just an observation and a question. I would suggest that before we get too depressed by the prognostications from the experts on the platform, to remember the example of Lord Kelvin, one of Britain's greatest scientists who did all the calculations, no doubt sat on lots of forums like this, and announced that heavier than air machines would never work. Something to bear in mind. Second, a simpler question. I was always given to understand in terms of the favourable dispensation of UK revenues, that the southeast of England did better than Scotland. Is there any truth in this?
One more question, Matt.
Is there anything in the present proposals to encourage wealth creation and business development and encouraging economic future?
Nicola, yeah.
Sure. To the last question, probably not, but I'll let my colleagues respond to that in more detail. For the gentleman there, I mean, I'm not saying it can't work. Can it be better? Yes, I think it can, but I think whichever package of proposals comes, there will be, whoever is in government, an attempt to try to make it work. My point is that I think the package of proposals that is currently presented have lots of unintended consequences, and we will have to live with those and manage those as best we can. And I think that's the point I'm trying to emphasise. I'm not sure I fully understood the lady's observation, but I think it's around political centralisation within Scotland, and I know that there is certainly concern about that, and there is a live debate about that. I would love for that to be a proper and meaningful and deliberative debate, because there's a lot of nonsense said about it too. If we are to have a kind of double devolution, if we are to devolve powers within Scotland, that's great, but that also has consequences, and we need a proper and mature debate about what those consequences would be. Are we happy to live with variations in entitlements within different parts of Scotland and different local authority areas, for example? Maybe we are, but we need to have a mature debate about that. And I would love for that to be a proper debate, the kind that we had in the run-up to the referendum, and not the very elite and driven and closed party political process that we have had since the referendum.
I'll pick up the issue around what's in the package that might actually help business development and wealth creation. The additional borrowing powers, if used, might I say it, for the right investments, could be seriously beneficial. So the question at the moment is, well, what would we use it for? If it was for fast train between Aberdeen and Edinburgh, for example, or helping ubiquitous use of broadband across the country, or better communications between Edinburgh, Glasgow and internationally, then that would help. We typically, however, spend money on hospitals and schools, and to some extent roads, new roads rather than serious roads maintenance. Serious roads maintenance does help, not connectivity. So we could do more, and it behoves the government to say why it's using its infrastructure spending the way it might want to. The Edinburgh-London effect, and I think that's an important one. I think, as Nicola said, there's a conversation to be had about whether we want to decentralise out of Edinburgh through to the local authorities and to more sparse parts of the country. But there is a benefit of having, the civil service, the legal profession, the kind of key professions located within Edinburgh for the benefit of the country as a whole, if you've got large corporates locating in Edinburgh. So unless you locate them outside of Edinburgh, then it perhaps doesn't have the same effect of what's called the agglomeration effect if they all stayed within Edinburgh. But you've got to understand the effect that has therefore on house pricing, and on just the cost of living within Edinburgh. So the debate that we're having is not, as Nicola said, not nearly sophisticated enough about how do we make sure that the wider parts or more parts of Scotland benefit from what we've seen in Edinburgh since devolution, and probably further from these new powers. On the southeast effect, or southeast getting more than its fair share, I think you've got to be careful about what you add into these calculations, but again, the southeast generates significantly more revenues too. So these numbers are usually used by statisticians to prove something or other. The southeast does get a lot of expenditure, principally again because of the London effect. We've got the Parliament down there, we've got significant infrastructure spending that features in we talked about earlier, the GERS report, that features in expenditure that's for the benefit of the whole country. So the development of King's Cross, or the development of Crossrail is for the benefit of the whole country, and it's therefore not just the southeast. So I think it's important. You can use a number of numbers. You can use the numbers in a variety of different ways to come up with a variety of different answers, depending on what answer you want. Yes, it gets a bit more, or no, it doesn't, depending on what you add in or take out.
Can I add two things on that? One is there isn't anything in the white paper or the proposals about wealth creation and improving productivity and the like. To be fair, that's not really what constitutional proposals are about. They are about providing a framework within which policies that are conducive to that could be made or could not be made. As far as what these policies are, I share Joe's desire for additional spending on infrastructure. I'm rather more sceptical about some of the examples she's illustrated, and I think we all have to have in mind that this is the country that built the Edinburgh tram and the Borders rail link, which seem to me just about as bad as it gets in terms of wasted expenditure on infrastructure project, on vanity infrastructure projects, essentially. There's this underlying issue in discussion of can this be made to work? And of course it can be made to work. Settlements of this kind are inevitably complicated, inevitably messy, and you need extended negotiation between thoughtful people on both sides to get good answers to these questions. There are two problems which are the reasons why I think the people on the platform tonight have been very critical about where we are at the moment. And one of these is that it is a matter for negotiation between people of goodwill who really want to arrive at a settlement. There are quite good reasons to think that that is not the position in which we are actually find ourselves, that there are quite a lot of people who really do not particularly want to make this structure work. And that is not helped, and this is my second point, by the fact that this paper is entitled An Enduring Settlement. It implies quite wrongly that the matters which it defines can be dealt with in future by essentially mechanical operation of the formulae which are described in it. And all these things are quite wrong. Actually, it is a good thing to achieve greater devolution within the UK if the UK is to survive. But the way to get at it is not by the process that has generated these particular documents.
Well, on that negative thought, are there any more questions? One at the back, one here.
Jack Matthews. As a non-economist, this is probably a very naive question, but is there any truth in the impression that I have that the high-speed link, which explicitly ends at Leeds and Manchester, is in some way an example of the Westminster Parliament acting as a Devo Max for England?
Thank you. There's another one over here.
It's been mentioned that the UK election has got a few different directions that it could go. I wondered if the panel could just talk about how the different possibilities from that election might affect the settlement.
Any more? Is that a third question? Right, let's deal with those two then.
I'll jump in on the high-speed link one. That's the safest of the two, I think. The high-speed link one, I think it's pork barrel politics. It's about trying to establish some sort of regional economic policy that has clearly been lacking from London, and the desire to try and create some sort of dynamic growth pool or city growth in Leeds, Manchester and in the north. It's a grand project in John's view of the world. Whether it produces the benefits that it has to produce to justify the cost that it's currently costing, only time will tell, and I fear it's probably in the same boat as the Edinburgh tram. Whether it's Devo Max for England, I really don't know. I just think it's about seem to be making significant infrastructure spending in a part of the country that probably feels left out.
Any comment on the consequences of the forthcoming election?
Oh, go on then. As the political scientist on the panel, I feel duty-bound. Obviously I haven't no more access to a crystal ball than anybody else here. But I think if the Conservatives are re-elected with a majority or as a minority or as a continuation of the current coalition, then we would expect the draft clauses as they are to go forward with some minor amendments unless the outcome in Scotland produces a change in the political landscape in Scotland, in which case, and particularly if the outcome in Scotland means that that government lost its one sole member of Parliament, then that potentially changes the dynamic in the relationship between the two administrations. And I think then you would start to see the Scottish Government go with some asks around employment policy, for example. I would imagine that that would be high up the list. The Labour Party has already signalled that it's moving away from the draft legislation, particularly in the area of housing benefit. Now, I haven't really heard too much of the detail of that, but presumably that signals that it would be open to looking again in some way at this set of recommendations, perhaps in a wider context of some of the broader constitutional arrangements throughout the UK. And again, that might depend on the Labour Party are unlikely to be elected with a majority unless something changes between now and election day. Would they be reliant upon the support of a nationalist bloc, or seeking a coalition partner that could utilise some leverage? I mean, these are very open questions that it's impossible to answer. But I think the broader point is that the general election and its outcome potentially opens some of this up again. I think there has been a very rushed process in the aftermath of the referendum. There's been a desire, it seems to me, on the part of the UK government to close this down. The language used around the publication of the draft legislation, not just in the title of the enduring settlement, but even in the words of the Prime Minister about this is the right resting place, the end of the road of Scotland's devolution journey. Well, I mean, I think I share your view that that's a hopelessly optimistic outlook. And I think the general election, and possibly the subsequent Scottish election, but more so this general election potentially, is something of a game changer, but it really depends on the outcome.
Could I just make a point about the housing benefit? It does strike me as an unsatisfactory situation where housing benefit remains the responsibility of Westminster, but housing, social housing, is the responsibility of the Scottish Government. Because the more the Scottish Government spends on social housing, the less need there will be for housing benefit, and vice versa. That doesn't strike me as a satisfactory long-term arrangement. And I'm therefore sympathetic to the idea that the whole responsibility of housing should come to the Scottish Government. But housing benefit has been conceived as part of Ian Duncan Smith's universal credit, and he's obviously very reluctant to take it out of that. Can we have one more question, and then I think we need to finish? Yes, at the back.
I was resisting asking a question because the early part of the discussion was very related to purely economic issues. We've moved more into the political sphere now. And I wonder sometimes when there's a lot of heady talk around occasionally of some form of federalism within the United Kingdom that could bring some sort of overall settlement. But I'm concerned that the electoral systems operating in Scotland, Northern Ireland and Wales are different from those that are operating in England, and that if we see this continual, I hesitate to call it devolution in England, it's more delegation from the UK government, the English bit of the UK government. In fact, this is what's happening, is delegation. But should it become a form of devolution, without a change in the electoral system within England, then I think you get a sort of imbalance that automatically exists, where you have the existing political parties in a strong first-past-the-post system. So you will have the right wing, the left wing, the whatever, and very little opportunity for sensible debate from smaller groupings that could bring about very different attitudes across British politics. So without that change in England, what hope is there really for any settlement which even begins to smack of federation?
Nicola, do you want to comment on that as the political scientist on the
I suppose less and less, given the likely fortunes of the Liberal Democrats, for whom that's a primary policy. I mean, ironically, we may be about to see, within the context of a first-past-the-post system, some smaller minority voices entering that parliament. I share the concern, I think, with the effects and the anomalies of the first past the post system in the Westminster context. But I don't think that having, I would be resistant to the idea that you had to have the same type of system across the UK. I think there are debates to be had in different bits of the UK as to the appropriate electoral system for it, rather than to have something that is coordinated and uniform across the different parts. I don't know if that really addresses your concern there. But I'm not sure that a form of federation is really a workable solution for the UK anyway, partly given the extraordinary asymmetry in our geography, in the institutions, and I think to try to impose something that tried to make it much more symmetrical would leave potentially a gaping hole at the centre, but create new anomalies as well that we would still be having to live with. So I'm not a federalist in that sense. I think there are other potential solutions for these issues, but I think the more you try to coordinate and control a coherent thing, the more problems will emerge as a result of that.
Thank you. Well, I think I'll now call on Michael Keating to give a vote of thanks.
Well, when we organised this seminar, we didn't expect to come to any conclusions, and we haven't come to any conclusions, but there is seem to be a consensus here that the proposals we have at the moment are not going to produce a settlement that is simple, that can be done quickly, or that is enduring. This is part of a much longer process. And one reason for that is we've got a habit here of talking about the Barnett formula and taxes in Scotland as though this was only a Scottish problem, as though tinkering around with the institutions was going to address the big questions. But this is part of a much bigger question, which is about the role of government and the role of the state and the future of the nation state, and particularly the future of the welfare state. We've been talking about the balance of welfare powers, but the really big question is what is going to happen to welfare in the future? We're going through a massive programme of welfare reform in the UK at the moment that is not going smoothly, to put it very, very mildly. We're seeing right across Europe welfare states being restructured to try and link passive welfare policy to active policy, getting people into work, to making that link between work and welfare. We're seeing the changing demographics of the welfare state posing huge challenges. We're seeing the old male breadwinner model of the household giving way to a much more complex society, and we're seeing the so-called new social risks. So what we thought was welfare, which could simply be allocated at various levels quite neatly, is not the same anymore, and we don't understand how it's changing. The other big change is about the rescaling of government. Nobody's talked about Europe this evening, but there's a process going on in Europe, taking things up to the European level. There are global markets that constrain various things that can be done by governments at all levels, and policy systems are shifting at different levels, so that we do things at some things at the European level, some things at the international, some things at the local level, and these are driven by very big forces. And finally, we see that the issue of the territorial distribution of money is becoming extraordinarily salient right across Europe, absolutely everywhere. It's becoming much more transparent, and these tensions are growing. And no country, no European country at all, has resolved this question of how you get a formula to distribute resources across territory that everybody accepts. You come up with messy compromises that people kind of live with. So these things are not going to be resolved in the short term. They're big questions. But Scotland is extraordinarily interesting. And when I go around Europe, people are interested in Scotland as an example of all this, because all of these things are focused in one place. Welfare reform, spatial rescaling, interterritorial competition, questions about the distribution of resources in a highly politicised context. And that's happened because this has become a salient issue in Scottish politics, and because we've had the referendum, which, whatever the quality of the debate and the outcome, certainly focused attention on these questions. So the issue is going to be around with us for a long time. Those of us who live off this have got a secure future, and so has the Royal Society, and we will continue in the Royal Society to pursue these issues and these debates. So I'd just like to thank our three speakers, Nicola, John and Joe. I'd like to thank Gavin for chairing this, and most of all I'd like to thank you for coming and posing these questions and making this debate worthwhile. And as we will be continuing these conversations over the next years and months, I hope we'll all see you again in the near future. Thank you.